grave intentions. The rain fell in relentless sheets, beating against the windshield of Jack's old pickup truck as he gripped the steering wheel tightly. Thunder cracked overhead, echoing across the empty fields that led to the town's cemetery, Blackthorn Rest. A fitting name, he thought grimly, for a place where the dead slumbered beneath jagged trees and overgrown vines, as if nature itself sought to reclaim the graveyard. "You sure about this, Jack?" Emily's voice broke through the steady rhythm of the rain, her tone laced with unease. Jack glanced at his childhood friend in the passenger seat, her face pale in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. "We can't let them get away with this. If what Mason heard is true, these guys have been vandalizing the graves for weeks. Someone has to put a stop to it." Behind them, Mason and Derek shifted in the back seat. Mason, the quiet observer of the group, leaned forward, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I heard them talking down by the bar last night. A couple of punks planning to dig up one of the older graves tonight. They think there's something valuable buried there." "Grave robbers? In this weather?" "They're insane," Derek muttered, shaking his head. "But you're right, Jack. If no one stops them, they'll keep doing it." Jack tightened his grip on the wheel as they approached the entrance to the cemetery. The iron gates stood open, swinging lazily in the wind, as if inviting them into the darkness beyond. Trees loomed on either side, their branches twisted and blackened against the stormy sky. The headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating rows of crumbling headstones and mausoleums, some dating back over a century. "All right, here's the plan," Jack said, pulling the truck to a stop near the caretaker's shed. "We split up. Mason, you and Derek check the northern section. Emily and I will take the south. Keep your phones on. If you see anything suspicious, call immediately." Emily sighed, pulling her hood up over her head. "I still think we should have called the police." Jack shook his head. "By the time they get here, those punks could be long gone. We've got to catch them in the act." Reluctantly, the group stepped out into the downpour, the rain immediately soaking through their clothes. The storm intensified, lightning flashing across the sky, casting eerie shadows over the gravestones. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying leaves, and the wind howled through the trees like a wailing banshee. Jack led the way, his flashlight cutting a narrow beam through the storm. Emily followed closely behind, her eyes scanning the rows of graves for any signs of movement. The cemetery was vast, stretching across several acres, with tombstones in various states of disrepair. Many had been forgotten, overtaken by weeds and vines, while others stood tall, monuments to lives long past. The storm made it difficult to hear anything over the wind and rain, but Jack kept his focus, determined to catch the miscreants in the act. As they moved deeper into the southern section, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The trees clustered closer together here, their branches hanging low like skeletal fingers. Every shadow seemed to shift in the periphery of their vision, but each time they turned to look, there was nothing there. "Do you think they're actually here?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "They're here," Jack replied, his tone grim. Mason wouldn't have lied about this. He overheard them talking. Just then, a distant sound cut through the storm, the unmistakable clang of metal against stone. Jack froze, holding up a hand to signal Emily to stop. His heart raced as he strained to listen. There it was again, faint but distinct. Someone was digging. "They're close," Jack hissed. He motioned for Emily to follow him, and they moved cautiously toward the sound. The noise grew louder as they approached the far edge of the cemetery, where the graves were older and more neglected. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the scene before them. 3 figures stood by an ancient grave, their shovels sinking into the wet earth. They worked quickly, their backs to Jack and Emily, oblivious to the storm raging around them. Jack felt a surge of anger. This was beyond vandalism. This was desecration. He was filled with seething rage. He signaled to Emily to stay back while he crept closer, his heart pounding in his chest. As he neared, he could make out their voices, shouting over the storm. "Hurry up," one of the men barked. "We don't have all night. Get to the coffin." The second man, taller and lankier than the first, cursed under his breath. "I'm digging as fast as I can. You said this would be easy." The third man, standing off to the side, appeared to be the lookout. His eyes darted around nervously, and he gripped a crowbar in his hand. Jack knew they had to act fast before these criminals realized they weren't alone. The time had come. He reached for his phone to text Mason, but before he could send the message, a loud crack of thunder startled him. His grip slipped and his phone fell into the mud with a soft splash. The lookout heard the noise. His head snapped in Jack's direction, and for a brief moment, their eyes locked. Jack's blood ran cold. The man's expression shifted from confusion to anger, and he raised the crowbar. "Hey, who's there?" the man shouted. Before Jack could react, the two diggers stopped and turned, spotting him in the shadows. The taller one cursed again and dropped his shovel, while the shorter man grabbed a flashlight from his bag, shining it in Jack's face. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Jack demanded, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his insides. The leader of the group sneered, taking a step forward. "Shouldn't you be home, hero? This place is closed for the night." Jack felt Emily move beside him, her hand gripping the flashlight tightly. "Leave, now," she said, her voice wavering slightly but still firm. "We've already called the police." The shorter man laughed, a cold, mirthless sound. "Nice try, sweetheart, but we're not done here yet." As if on cue, the taller man kicked the dirt mound they had been digging, revealing the edge of a weathered coffin beneath. Jack's stomach twisted at the sight. These weren't just punks vandalizing graves for fun. They were after something they thought was buried with the dead. Before Jack could say another word, the lookout lunged forward with the crowbar. Jack dodged to the side just in time, the metal narrowly missing his head. Emily screamed, raising her flashlight and swinging it at the attacker, but he was too quick. He shoved her hard, and she stumbled back, hitting the ground with a thud. "Emily!" Jack shouted, his heart pounding in his ears. The leader grinned, his teeth flashing in the dim light. "Looks like we've got ourselves a couple of heroes. Too bad for you, this is our turf." Jack clenched his fists, his mind racing. They were outnumbered, and the miscreants had weapons, but he couldn't let them get away with this. He had to stall for time. He could not be scared. That would just embolden the miscreants. "What's in that grave? Why are you doing this?" Jack asked, trying to buy a few seconds. The leader's grin faded, and his expression darkened. "None of your business. Let's just say some things are worth more than money." With a flick of his wrist, the leader signaled to the others. The lookout and the tall man advanced, their faces twisted with malice. Jack braced himself, but just as the tall man reached him, a blinding flash of lightning lit up the cemetery, followed by the loudest crack of thunder Jack had ever heard. For a split second, everything froze. The storm raged overhead, and the ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Jack saw movement, someone running toward them through the rain. "Mason!" Jack shouted, relief flooding through him. Mason and Derek burst onto the scene, their faces set in determination. Without hesitation, Mason tackled the lookout, knocking the crowbar from his hand. Derek, the athlete, charged at the tall man, shoving him away from Jack. The cemetery erupted into chaos. Jack lunged at the leader, catching him off guard. They grappled in the mud, slipping and sliding as they fought for control. The rain poured down in torrents, mixing with the dirt and blood as fists flew and bodies collided. Emily, regaining her footing, grabbed the crowbar from the ground and swung it at the tall man, who had regained his balance. The metal connected with a sickening thud, and the man crumpled to the ground, unconscious. Jack, fueled by adrenaline, finally overpowered the leader, pinning him to the ground. "It's over," he shouted, breathing heavily. The leader struggled, his eyes wild with anger. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he spat. Just as the words left his mouth, a distant siren pierced through the storm. The police were finally on their way. As the flashing blue lights approached, Jack released his grip on the leader and stood up, panting. The remaining miscreants were subdued, lying in the mud, their plans thwarted. Jack looked down at the disturbed grave, the old coffin lying exposed. Whatever they had been after, it was still a mystery. But as the rain washed away the dirt and blood, he knew one thing for sure. They had come far too close to crossing a line that should never be crossed, and Blackthorn Rest would never feel the same again. As the police cars pulled up to the cemetery gates, their lights casting eerie flashes of red and blue over the gravestones, Jack finally allowed himself to exhale. His body ached from the scuffle, and the cold rain continued to pelt his face, but at least the immediate danger was over. Emily, Mason, and Derek gathered beside him, breathing heavily but unscathed. The miscreants lay in the mud, restrained by Mason and Derek, groaning as they came to terms with their defeat. 2 officers emerged from the squad cars, guns drawn, moving cautiously toward the group. One of them, Officer Morales, shone his flashlight over the scene, his eyes narrowing as he took in the exposed grave, the mud-splattered miscreants, and the battered group of friends standing over them. "Everyone all right?" Morales called out as he holstered his weapon. He was a tall, stocky man with a grizzled look that suggested he had seen more than his fair share of trouble in this town. The other officer, a younger woman with a sharp gaze, followed close behind. "We're fine," Jack said, his voice hoarse. "These guys were digging up a grave. We stopped them, but we don't know why." Officer Morales' face darkened as he approached the disturbed grave. He glanced down at the half-buried coffin, still partially submerged in the earth. "Grave robbing? In this weather?" he muttered, shaking his head. "What the hell were they thinking?" The younger officer cuffed the leader of the group, who was still glaring defiantly at Jack. "You're all going downtown," she said, pulling the man to his feet. "And I suggest you start talking about what you were doing out here." The leader spat in the mud, his face a twisted mix of anger and disdain. "You wouldn't understand," he growled. "This wasn't about money. We were looking for something that's not meant to stay buried." Officer Morales exchanged a glance with his partner, his brow furrowed. "What the hell does that mean?" The leader gave a twisted smile. "You'll find out soon enough." Before anyone could respond, a low rumbling sound echoed through the cemetery. At first, Jack thought it was more thunder from the storm, but then the ground beneath their feet trembled ever so slightly. Everyone froze, their eyes widening in confusion and fear. "What was that?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Officer Morales crouched by the grave, shining his flashlight into the exposed coffin. The dirt around it shifted unnaturally, as if something beneath the surface was stirring. "Get back," he ordered, standing quickly. "Everyone, get back now!" Jack felt a chill creep up his spine as he and the others instinctively retreated. The miscreants, now looking just as frightened as the rest of them, were silent, their earlier bravado vanished. Without warning, the ground near the coffin collapsed, creating a small sinkhole. Dirt and debris spilled into the void, and from within came the unmistakable sound of something creaking, wood groaning under pressure. Jack's heart raced as he stared at the coffin, half buried in the mud. It had started to shift, tilting as if being pulled from below. "Oh my God," Emily whispered, clutching Jack's arm. Before anyone could process what was happening, a skeletal hand burst through the coffin's lid, its fingers curling upward through the mud. Jack's mind reeled as he struggled to comprehend the impossible. The officers drew their guns, but Morales hesitated, his face pale. The ground heaved again, and the coffin splintered open, revealing the decayed remains of whatever or whoever had been buried there. But it wasn't the skeletal figure that terrified Jack. It was the feeling in the air, the oppressive weight of something ancient and malevolent awakening. The leader of the miscreants laughed, his voice manic and wild. You see? You see what we were after? It's here. It's been waiting for centuries, buried beneath this cursed earth." Officer Morales fired a warning shot into the ground, silencing the man's crazed laughter. "Shut up," he barked. "Everyone needs to get out of here now." But it was too late. The skeletal figure rose from the shattered coffin, dirt and roots clinging to its bones. Its hollow eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, and a strange, unnatural light flickered in its chest, where its heart should have been. Jack felt his legs turn to jelly as he watched in horror. Whatever had been buried here wasn't human anymore. If it ever had been... "Run!" Derek shouted, pulling Mason toward the gate. Jack grabbed Emily's hand, and they sprinted toward the pickup truck, hearts pounding as the creature fully emerged from the ground. The rain lashed at their faces, but they didn't dare look back. Officer Morales and his partner were shouting for backup, but Jack knew that no amount of police would be able to stop what had been unleashed. They reached the truck, diving into the cab as lightning illuminated the cemetery once more. Through the windshield, Jack could see the figure standing motionless by the grave, its empty eyes fixed on them. For a brief, terrifying moment, the world seemed to stand still. Then, with a final, earth-shattering crack of thunder, the figure began to move. "Drive!" Emily screamed, her voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. Jack didn't need to be told twice. He jammed the key into the ignition and floored the gas pedal. The truck lurched forward, tires spinning in the mud, then as they tore away from Blackthorn Rest. In the rearview mirror, Jack saw the miscreants running in different directions, scattering like frightened animals. Morales and his partner were backing away toward their squad car, still barking into their radios. But the creature, it was following them, its skeletal form gliding over the ground as if it weighed nothing at all. "What the hell is that thing?" Mason shouted from the back seat, his voice trembling. "I don't know." Jack yelled, swerving around a corner as they sped through the cemetery gates and onto the main road. "I don't know." Emily was clutching the dashboard, her face pale. "We have to get out of here. Whatever that thing is, it's not stopping." Jack kept his foot on the gas, the truck barreling down the dark, rain-soaked road. His mind was racing, desperately trying to process what had just happened. They had gone to stop a group of grave robbers, but instead, they had unleashed something far worse. Something ancient. Something evil. As they rounded a bend in the road, Jack glanced in the rearview mirror once more. The cemetery was fading into the distance, and the figure was no longer visible. But the dread hadn't left him. It clung to him like the cold rain, whispering that whatever had been buried in Blackthorn Rest wasn't finished. That it would come for them. Maybe not tonight, but soon. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. "We need to warn the others," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily nodded, still staring out the window, her mind clearly elsewhere, if it's even possible to stop it. Mason and Derek remained silent in the back, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. The storm raged on, and as they drove further from the cemetery, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't escaped at all. They had only delayed the inevitable. The Silent Watcher of Pine Hill Cemetery. My name is Sam Navarro, and I work as the operations coordinator at Pine Hill Cemetery, a peaceful yet somber place. My role involves everything from setting up funeral services to ensuring that the grounds are always neat and well kept. While the job comes with its own set of challenges, it's generally predictable. I meet grieving families, help arrange plots for their loved ones, and oversee the final moments when they say goodbye. It's an emotionally draining job, but I've gotten used to the rhythm of it over the years. Or so I thought. Things can change for the worse so quickly in our lives, and sometimes the changes cannot be explained with logic. A few months ago, a man named Hector Alvarez came into my office. He was in his early 40s, strong but visibly worn out. Hector's father, Arturo, had been battling a serious illness for some time and was now in hospice care. The Alvarez family had decided to prepare for the inevitable, and Hector, being the eldest son, took the responsibility of securing his father's final resting place. Hector had a quiet intensity about him. His words were few, but his eyes spoke volumes. Grief, resignation, love. He handed me an old, worn-out photograph of his father. The man in the picture had a warm smile, with kind eyes that held a sense of calm. He seemed too full of life to be near death, yet Hector assured me that Arturo's time was running out. I guided Hector through the process, helping him select a plot beneath a large oak tree near the far end of the cemetery. A few days later, Arturo passed away. Hector returned to my office, eyes bloodshot but his demeanor calm, and arranged for the funeral. The day of the burial was gloomy. Rain poured relentlessly from a sky that seemed to mourn alongside the family. Dark clouds hung low, and the cemetery was enveloped in a thick, suffocating mist. The storm that rolled in was far more aggressive than the weather report had predicted, and it felt as though the very ground was weeping with the sky. I stood under the awning of the office building as the funeral procession arrived. The hearse stopped briefly, and I saw Hector sitting stoically in the car behind it. We exchanged nods, but I could see the weight of grief pressing down on him. The procession continued to the burial site, and I followed in one of the cemetery's old pickup trucks. My job was to supervise from a distance, ensuring everything went according to plan, despite the terrible weather. The service was simple and quiet. Arturo was laid to rest under the oak tree, the sound of the rain drowning out the murmurs of those gathered. Once the burial was completed, I did my usual routine, driving around the grounds in the truck to ensure all was in order. The rain blurred the edges of everything, making the headstones look like shadowy figures standing sentinel over the dead. I had a mountain of paperwork to finish, but as evening approached, I needed to prepare for the cemetery's closure. Pine Hill closes at 6 p.m., and with the storm, it already felt like midnight. I grabbed my umbrella and made my final round, ensuring there were no lingering visitors. As I was about to lock the main gate, something caught my eye, a figure walking quickly between the rows of gravestones. The silhouette moved with a strange urgency, heading toward a cluster of trees near the far end of the cemetery. I couldn't make out who it was, but given the weather and the time, it was clear they weren't supposed to be there. I honked the horn and called out, "Hey, cemetery's closing!" The figure didn't respond. I saw them slip behind a large monument and out of sight. My heart pounded as I debated what to do. It was pouring, and the visibility was terrible, but I couldn't leave without ensuring that no one was still on the grounds. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out of the truck and ran into the rain. I headed toward the monument where I had seen the figure. The rain slashed at my face, making it hard to see, but I pressed on. When I reached the spot, there was no one. I searched the area, checking behind every tombstone and tree, but the figure had vanished. After a thorough search, I headed back to the truck, soaked to the bone. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it just a visitor who had already left? Or had someone sneaked into the cemetery for some other reason? Back at my office, I decided to check the security footage. I pulled up the CCTV feed and scrolled through the recordings, trying to catch a glimpse of the mysterious figure. The cameras had a limited view due to the rain and fog, but I couldn't see anyone. Frustrated and uneasy, I returned to my desk to finish up my paperwork. As the storm outside grew fiercer, the wind howled through the cracks in the window panes, making the entire office seem alive with sound. I tried to focus on my tasks when suddenly, the heavy front door to the office slammed shut with a loud bang. My heart jumped into my throat. "Hello?" I called out, standing up from my desk. No response. I grabbed my flashlight again and walked out into the lobby, convinced that someone had wandered in to escape the rain. The lobby was empty, but the door was ajar. I stepped outside, scanning the area with my flashlight, but there was no one there. The rain continued its relentless assault, and the cemetery was deathly silent, save for the storm. I turned back to close the door when I saw him. A figure stood outside the office window, just a few feet away, staring at me. His face was pale and blank, his eyes hollow and expressionless. My heart froze as I realized who it was. It was Arturo Alvarez. The same man I had buried that very afternoon, now standing in the rain, watching me through the window. His gaze locked onto mine, unblinking, as if he were waiting for something. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Was this a hallucination? Whatever it might have been, I cannot even begin describing the chilling fear I felt throughout my entire body and mind. I was lucky that I had not fainted yet. Arturo was dead. I had watched his burial. I was there. And yet, there he was, motionless, rainwater dripping from his soaked clothes, staring with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. In a blind panic, I rushed outside to confront him, but when I reached the spot where he had stood, he was not there any longer. He was gone, vanished into the thin air, into the mist. There were no footsteps, no sign of him at all. I frantically searched the grounds, my flashlight beam slicing through the sheets of rain, but the cemetery was as empty as ever. The eerie silence engulfing the entire area. Breathing heavily, I stumbled back to the office, locking the door behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys. I had to leave. I needed to get out of there now. The storm outside now seemed to close in around me, the wind and rain pounding against the walls like something alive. I packed my things as fast as I could, grabbed my coat, and ran to my truck. As I drove toward the cemetery gate, lightning illuminated the rows of tombstones, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out toward me. When I reached the gate, I hesitated, glancing in my rearview mirror. For a brief second, I thought I again saw Arturo standing there, just at the edge of the cemetery, watching me leave. I didn't wait to find out if he was really there. I locked the gate, sped home, and didn't look back. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed the events over and over, the figure I had seen, the door slamming, Arturo's lifeless stare at me. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that grief and exhaustion had warped my perception, elevated my imagination. But deep down, I knew that what I had seen was real. The next morning, I returned to Pine Hill Cemetery as usual. The storm had passed, leaving the grounds wet and muddy. As I walked toward the oak tree where Arturo was buried, a strange sense of unease washed over me. The ground around his grave was untouched, as though nothing unusual had happened. But when I looked closer, something sent a chill down my spine. On the gravestone, etched into the stone, was a fresh set of fingerprints. The sight of the fingerprints sent a cold rush down my spine. My heart raced, and I froze, staring at the gravestone. They were unmistakable, wet, smudged fingerprints, like someone had gripped the stone with force, leaving behind muddy streaks. My first instinct was to rationalize it. Maybe a mourner had leaned on the stone during the burial. But the problem was, these prints were fresh. The rain had washed everything clean the night before, and no one had been here since the cemetery had closed. There was something sinister in the air. I knelt down, running my fingers over the stone. The prints felt strange, almost cold to the touch, even though the air was warming up after the storm. My mind raced back to the image of Arturo's lifeless face watching me through the window the night before. Was it possible that his spirit was lingering here? That thought alone made me feel queasy. I shook my head, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. I was probably overthinking it. Between the storm, the funeral, and the long hours, my mind was just playing tricks on me. But even as I told myself this, I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread that clung to me like the dampness in the air. I returned to the office, where the atmosphere felt even heavier than usual. The faint hum of the lights and the occasional gust of wind outside did little to comfort me. As I sat down at my desk, I stared at the CCTV feed once more, hoping to catch a glimpse of anything that could explain what had happened the night before. Hours passed, and nothing seemed unusual. Just the silent, still rows of graves, stretching into the distance. I tried to busy myself with paperwork, but my mind kept drifting back to Arturo's face, those lifeless eyes boring into me. I couldn't help but feel like he was still watching me. Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set, the familiar sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. At first, I thought it was a visitor. The cemetery wasn't closed yet, and it wasn't uncommon for people to visit late, especially after a recent burial. But the footsteps were slow, deliberate, and they seemed to be getting closer. Too close. "Hello?" I called out, standing up from my desk. No answer. The footsteps stopped just outside my office door. I felt my pulse quicken as I slowly approached the door. When I opened it, the hallway was empty, but the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. My breath caught in my throat as I glanced around. The light in the hallway flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. The temperature seemed to drop suddenly, and a faint chill crawled up my spine. I tried to steady myself, taking deep breaths. Just as I turned to go back to my desk, I heard it, faint at first but unmistakable, the sound of labored breathing. It was slow and deep, like someone struggling to draw in air, but there was no one there. I bolted back into my office, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to catch my breath. What was happening? Was I losing my mind? I decided to check the cemetery one more time before closing, hoping a final lap around the grounds would calm my nerves. Grabbing my keys, I headed out to the pickup truck. The air outside was unnaturally still, as if the world was holding its breath. I drove slowly through the rows of headstones, the headlights casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the graves. As I neared Arturo's grave, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing beneath the oak tree, just beside the fresh grave, was a figure, tall, unmoving, and familiar. I hit the brakes, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The figure stood facing the grave, its back to me, but I knew who it was. It was Arturo. My heart hammered in my chest. This couldn't be real. I had seen him buried. He was gone. But there he stood, as real as anything else in the cemetery. I blinked, my mind racing to find a rational explanation, but nothing came. I stepped out of the truck, my legs shaking as I approached the figure. "Arturo?" I whispered, my voice barely audible above the wind. He didn't move. I circled around, trying to get a better look at his face, but as I did, I realized something horrifying. His body wasn't solid. It was translucent, like a shadow made of mist. Suddenly, Arturo's head turned slowly toward me. His eyes were empty sockets, dark and void, yet I could feel them burning into my soul. His mouth opened, and that same labored breathing from earlier filled the air around me, louder now, closer. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root, and I fell hard onto the wet ground. The wind picked up, howling through the cemetery as if it carried the voices of the dead. Arturo's figure began to fade, dissolving into the mist that swirled around the graves. But before he disappeared entirely, I heard a voice, his voice. "You didn't finish," it whispered, chilling me to the core. I scrambled to my feet, running back to the truck, my mind racing. What did he mean? What hadn't I finished? I didn't dare look back as I sped toward the gate, heart pounding and breath shallow. The words echoed in my mind all night long, keeping me awake. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, those hollow eyes staring into me, his breath rasping in the dark. I had never been a superstitious man, but there was no denying what I had seen. Something was wrong. Something had been left unfinished, and now Arturo's spirit was stuck, trapped between the world of the living and the dead. The next morning, I did something I had never done before. I called Hector. His voice was tired when he answered, but there was an urgency when I explained what had happened. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before Hector spoke. "He didn't want to be buried here," Hector admitted quietly. I hung up the phone, a cold realization settling over me. Arturo wasn't at peace because his final wishes had been ignored. And now, his restless spirit was bound to the cemetery, waiting, watching. Later that day, the family came together and arranged for Arturo's exhumation and cremation. It was a quiet, somber affair, but as the smoke from the crematorium rose into the sky, I felt a sense of peace settle over the cemetery. The wind was calm, the air was warm, and for the first time in days, I didn't feel like I was being watched. Arturo was finally at rest. But even now, as I sit in my office, I can't shake the feeling that Pine Hill Cemetery has more secrets buried within its grounds. And sometimes late at night, when the wind howls through the trees, I swear I can still hear that slow, labored breathing. Faint, but ever present. The incident in the cemetery. It was the dead of winter when my friend Matt, a guy who always sought out adrenaline-pumping adventures, came over to hang out. I was lounging in my living room, scrolling through Netflix, when he burst in with a mischievous grin and a peculiar idea that immediately set my nerves on edge. "Hey, Nate," he said, holding a coffee cup in one hand and a smirk on his face. "Let's go check out that old cemetery across town, the one no one ever talks about." His voice had a strange thrill to it, as if daring me to say no. I stared at him, bewildered. "The cemetery? At this time of year? It's pitch black out there." "That's the whole point," he said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "No one goes there at night, especially in this weather." I hesitated. Everyone in town knew the eerie stories surrounding old Galloway Cemetery. It wasn't just an ordinary cemetery. It was practically a relic, hidden deep within the woods on the outskirts of town, with gravestones dating back to the 1800s. And it was infamous for its unsettling atmosphere, the kind that made your skin prickle and your pulse race. The entire area was fenced in by a rusted iron gate and surrounded by dense, heavy woods. On one side, the forest seemed to swallow everything in darkness. On another side stood a crumbling, abandoned Victorian mansion that was rumored to be haunted. But what made it particularly creepy was the fact that no one ever tended to it. There were no flowers, no offerings, no signs that anyone had visited in years. It was as if the place had been erased from people's memories. My friends and I had driven by it a few times, but none of us had ever considered going inside. Matt leaned forward, sensing my hesitation. "Come on, we've got no classes tomorrow. Besides, aren't you even a little curious?" I sighed. I'd always been the cautious one, while Matt lived for adventure, and maybe that was part of the reason I found myself nodding reluctantly. "All right, fine, but just for a quick look." The weather matched our destination perfectly, cloudy, with a strange reddish tint to the sky, as if dusk was frozen in place. Matt pulled up his old Jeep on a deserted road a few hundred feet from the cemetery. We got out, making our way through the thick underbrush and trees to avoid being seen from the road. The fence around the cemetery loomed ahead, its twisted iron bars glistening with moisture from the light drizzle that had started falling. "Okay, let's do this," Matt whispered, grinning as he climbed over the fence with ease. I followed, feeling a strange chill run down my spine as I landed softly on the other side. The cemetery was deathly silent. Rows of archaic gravestones jutted out of the earth like broken teeth, many of them cracked and weathered beyond recognition. A dense layer of mist clung to the ground, swirling around our feet as we moved deeper into the plot. I scanned the area, my gaze drifting to the massive, decrepit mansion on the far side of the cemetery. Its windows were shattered, its walls covered in vines, and its once grand front porch sagged under decades of decay. "This place is giving me the creeps," I muttered, glancing uneasily at the mansion. "Why did you want to come here, Matt?" He shrugged. "Curiosity, I guess. I heard some people talking at school, saying weird things happen here at night." I rolled my eyes. "Like what?" "Like sightings. People sneaking around. Rituals, maybe," he said, his voice dropping to a hushed tone. "Or just a bunch of crazy people trying to freak others out." "Fantastic," I mumbled, feeling my unease grow. This was a terrible idea. Matt didn't respond, his attention shifting to a row of gravestones ahead. The inscriptions were almost impossible to read, worn away by time and weather. The air seemed to grow heavier as we approached, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. "Hey, check this out," he whispered, kneeling by one particularly ancient-looking tombstone. I leaned closer, squinting at the barely visible carvings. But then I froze. Something moved out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker, a shadow, near the mansion. I whipped my head around, heart hammering in my chest. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing at one of the broken windows, but it was gone as soon as I focused on it, vanishing into the darkness. "Matt," I whispered urgently, grabbing his arm. "There's someone watching us." He glanced over at the mansion, his expression serious now. "Where?" "Up there, in the window. I swear I saw someone." He squinted, scanning the upper floors of the mansion, then shrugged. "Probably just your imagination. But hey, let's go check it out." I balked. "What? No way. We should leave." But Matt was already walking toward the mansion, cutting through the overgrown cemetery paths. I hesitated, then cursed under my breath and followed him. If there really was someone there, I didn't want to be left alone out here. The mansion loomed larger as we approached, its shadow stretching across the cemetery like a dark, skeletal hand. As we reached the front steps, Matt pushed open the creaking wooden door, peering inside. I reluctantly stepped in behind him, my eyes darting around nervously. The interior was worse than I expected. Broken furniture, shattered glass, and debris littered the floor. A musty, decaying smell hung in the air, and every step we took echoed through the hollow, empty halls. But what really caught my attention was the strange, almost unnatural silence. It felt like the entire house was holding its breath. "Look at this," Matt whispered, pointing to a dark stain on the floorboards. My stomach churned as I realized what it was. Blood. And it wasn't old either. The stain was fresh, glistening faintly in the dim light. A cold dread crept through me as I backed away. "Matt, we need to leave," Now. But before he could respond, a loud crack split the silence. I spun around, heart leaping into my throat. An old man, dressed in a ragged coat and torn jeans, stood in the doorway. His hair was wild and unkempt, his eyes bloodshot and crazed, and he was holding a long, rusted knife. "Get out!" he roared, his voice a guttural snarl that sent shivers down my spine. "You don't belong here." For a moment, I was frozen, staring at him in shock. But then Matt grabbed my arm, yanking me backward. "Run!" We bolted for the back door, my pulse thundering in my ears. The old man lunged at us, the knife slashing through the air just inches from Matt's shoulder. We tore through the back door and stumbled into the cemetery, sprinting through the rows of gravestones. But the man was fast, too fast. I glanced over my shoulder, terror gripping me as I saw him bounding over the gravestones, his eyes fixed on us. "He's right behind us," I gasped. "Keep running," Matt shouted. We crashed through the underbrush, ducking and weaving between the trees as the rain poured down harder. The ground was slick, the mud sucking at our feet. I could hear the man's ragged breathing close behind, hear the crunch of leaves and twigs under his boots, and then, out of nowhere, a deafening bang rang out. The man staggered, clutching his chest. He looked down, his face contorted in shock, then crumpled to the ground. Panting, I turned and saw two figures standing at the edge of the woods, two men in dark jackets, guns drawn. I realized with a jolt that they weren't police. Their eyes were cold and unreadable as they approached the old man's body, then glanced up at us. "Get out of here," one of them said quietly, his voice flat and emotionless. "You didn't see anything." I didn't argue. I grabbed Matt's arm and we ran, not stopping until we reached his jeep and peeled out of there, our hearts pounding. To this day, I don't know who those men were or why that old man was so desperate to keep us away. But I do know one thing: there are secrets buried in old Galloway Cemetery that are better left alone, and I'll never, ever go back.